So in this movie, we're going to look at 4 ways to define the value for the argument in a function. The first way we're going to look at is hard coding the value, and then we're going to reference a value that's contained in another cell or a region, and then we're going to define the value of the argument using another function or formula, and then we'll use something called an indirect reference. So I've got a worksheet set up with some information on here, and if you utilize Excel for any significant period of time, or even a short period of time, you're probably going to end up using a Vlookup if you don't already know what it is. But if you don't, I'm going to explain a Vlookup and use it to demonstrate how to define the arguments in a Vlookup. And a Vlookup has 4 arguments. We have the lookup value, the table array, the column index number, and then an optional argument called the range lookup. I want to escape out of that. I've got some formatting so that we can sync up what's going on the left side of the worksheet with what's going on the right side of the worksheet. The values that are going to be looked up are in the brown-filled cells. In the table array that's framed out in a red border, and the column index number is listed in green. So we have column 1s through 5. So the way this works, and I'm going to begin with the first example, and that is to hard code these argument values. I'm going to press F2 so that we can see the function a little bit better. In this function that's in H5, we're going to look up A, that's the lookup value, and we're going to look for A in the brown-filled cells in the region My Data that's now framed out in purple, and we're going to go to the 3rd column. And the 4th argument, false, just means we want to find an exact match. I'm going to escape out of that. And the result of this function is telling us it's 178. So let's see. We're going to look for A in this region. And A is right there. And then we're going to go over to the 3rd column, and that's 178. So that's the way the Vlookup works. And in the cell H5, our Vlookup function has all the arguments defined in a way that they are hard-coded. In other words, all of the arguments are defined definitively within the context of the function. If I copy this function someplace else, it's still going to be looking for A in the range My Data and going to the 3rd column. And it'll return a result of 178 every single time. A second way to define the value of the arguments in a function, in this case it's the Vlookup function, is to reference a cell that provides the value for that argument. In this case, the lookup value is not hard-coded. It's referencing an external cell outside of the context of the function itself. And so it will pick up what is contained in cell D8, which currently it's the letter B, look in My Data, that region, and then go to the 2nd column, which is driven by the number 2 in cell F8. So I can escape out of that. And when we look for B, it's right here. The 2nd column in contains a value of 171, and that's the result we get from our Vlookup function. Since we are referencing an external cell outside of the framework of the function, and we're not hard-coding those argument values, I can change the letter that's in D8 from B to, let's say, E, and my Vlookup generates a new result. Same thing with the 2nd column. I can go to the 5th column, for instance, and I get yet another result. So this provides some flexibility in generating and defining values for the arguments that are contained within the functions. You can also define the argument value by referencing yet another function or another formula. Pressing F2, the lookup value is hard-coded. It's looking for A. My Data is a named range. That's also hard-coded within the function. But the column that the Vlookup is looking for is determined by a function called ranBetween. And ranBetween is going to generate a random number, a whole number in this case, that's between the numbers 2 and 5, because I want the column index number to be either 2, 3, 4, or 5. And the 4th argument, false, is hard-coded. It'll look for an exact value. I want to escape out of this. And ranBetween will generate another number every time I recalculate the worksheet or recalculate the cell, which I'm going to do by pressing F2 enter, and I get a different value, 173. Going back up, F2, enter, now I get 183. And of course, RAM between could actually produce the same number twice. There's only 4 different numbers that are being generated, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So we can define the argument value using another function or formula, which itself also has argument values that can be defined in one of these 4 ways as well. The fourth way I want to show you as to how to generate a value for the arguments is to use an indirect reference. I'm going to arrow down and press F2. And again, we have the lookup value, A, that's hard-coded. And then I'm using an indirect reference to reference cell E14 to define the region that the lookup function is going to look in to give me the value that's in column 3 in this case. I want to escape out of this. And I have some data validation set up so that the value of this cell can only be my data or your data. And when I change the content of this cell to your data, I get an error message in my Vlookup formula because A is not contained in your data. A is contained in my data. So the indirect reference is referencing the text value that's contained in cell E14 to determine the argument value that is the table array. I'm going to change that back to my data and get rid of that error message. And then go down to the next example. This is another example where everything is hard-coded. But instead of using the named range for the table array, I define the range using the cell address, K4 to O32. That also can be generated external to the function in another cell, and then you can use an indirect reference to pull it into the Vlookup function in the following way. I've got K4 to O32 in cell E16, and I have an indirect reference in the place of the argument for the table array. Without getting too sidetracked with indirect references, this is the power of the indirect reference, where you can build a text string that defines the argument that you would otherwise see contained within the function that you're using. This can provide a lot of flexibility so that you can generate a value for any of the arguments in a function externally. And taking the indirect reference to its absurdity almost in this case, going down another cell, F2, we can define the value of each one of the 4 arguments for the Vlookup function using the indirect reference. So we can define these values externally. In this case, the lookup value is going to be the value that's in D17, which is currently P. We'll look in your data currently, column 5, and the word false that's in G17 defines the 4th argument. So I'm going to escape out of that. And we can change any one of these values and get a new result in cell H17. I can change that to a Q. I can change to my data, and we'll get an NA because Q doesn't exist in the data region my data. So I can go back and change this to a C and then get a valid result. Change this to column 3 and also change the last argument to true and still get a valid result from the Vlookup function. So we use the Vlookup function to demonstrate how you can define the value for the arguments necessary for the function to generate a result. You can hard-code all the argument values. You can reference an external value that's a value that's contained in a cell or a region. You can use another function or formula to generate the value for the argument. Or you can use an indirect reference that allows you to build a text string in a cell which can then be referenced within the function that you're building using an indirect reference in place of the argument so that the cell that contains the text string defines the value for that argument.